Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for joining us today. Our topic is the devastating mental health condition known as burnout, how to recover from it and how to avoid getting burned out in the first place. My guest is Dr. Jonathan Hoover, author of the book Stress Fracture, Your Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout. Dr. Hoover is a pastor and a Regent University professor of psychology. Dr. Hoover, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see you.
It's such a joy to be here with you.
So, we talk about burnout, and it's sort of a colloquial term. A lot of people think it's slang, but it's actually recognized by the World Health Organization as an actual disease. What made you get so interested in burnout, and what prompted you to write this book?
You mentioned I serve as a pastor. My dad has been the pastor of the same church here in Wichita for just under 40 years, and I joined the staff back in 2010. And the church had experienced explosive growth, and everything was going so wonderfully. And my dad had been this really respected and looked up to leader, and just seemed like everything he touched was working. And then in 2010, out of the blue, he hit this wall, and it was just an emotional and physical crisis that he experienced, and it shocked us all. All of us were like, what in the world is going on? This is the guy who's always the adult in the room. This is the guy that we always look up to ask the questions. And suddenly he was dying. He was struggling with questions about, his spiritual connection to God. And he was having all kinds of worrisome physical symptoms. And the challenge was nobody could tell us what it was he was going through. Nobody was able to give us good counsel about how to help him. Fortunately, God brought him through that, and he was able to recover. But in those days, as I was sort of just trying to keep the wheels on, I was a newly minted 29-year-old pastor preaching in my dad's place. Our church was about 4,000 on the weekend at that time. So it was like trial by fire, going right into the middle of that. But I kind of promised myself, when we get through all of this, I'm going to figure out what this was. I had just started studying psychology. And as I finished, my graduate work, all through that time, I was thinking, I've got to figure out what happened to my dad, and I want to learn more about it. The interesting thing is, the more I studied it, the more I found out that this has happened to so many people, leaders especially, who just go through this season where they hit the wall. And, in the old days, they used to call it a nervous breakdown. I think you can have burnout and not quite be at the point of a nervous breakdown, but that's really what it was for my dad. And that really inspired me. And so that caused me to do tons and tons of academic research. I started researching burnout academically. And that's what I continue to do to this day at Regent and with other professors across the world, actually. But one of the things that I always wanted to do was write the book that I wish we could have given my dad in 2010 that we just couldn't find. We couldn't find a resource that had the right answers. And and if you open the front flap, you'll see we dedicated it to my dad, because it is the book that I wish we could have given him back then, and the book that I hope will be beneficial to those who are dealing with burnout. It's such a painful thing. And we wanted there to be a really well-researched, if you look back at the references section, there's a ton there, a really well-researched resource on how to deal with burnout and how to prevent it, hopefully.
And I'm glad that you brought out the fact that a lot of leaders are the ones who suffer burnout, because these are good people. These are people who try so hard and are working so hard. And these are the people that suffer from burnout. And it doesn't have to necessarily be your job that you drive to or go to. A lot of people, their job is at home, being a full-time stay-at-home mom or a caregiver. If you have a parent, God forbid, who has Alzheimer's or is just declining physically, and you're taking care, any type of a caregiver also is very much at risk of burnout. So you've got these people who are working so hard, and it's very tragic. And it does seem like more people are burned out these days too. How do you know if you're burned out? Like, what are the symptoms of burnout?
Well, I think there are symptoms physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Physically, you're going to probably have some pain that you can't explain, muscle pain especially. So you're going to have, it's very common with people who are going through burnout to have neck pain, shoulder pain, back pain. It's very common to have digestive issues, indigestion. It's very common to start to just not feel right. That's something that, as I've interviewed tons of people, that's the thing that I've heard over and over again. It just don't feel right. But remember that pain happens in the brain. It doesn't happen in the body. And so there can be triggers that feel very physical. I feel it in my body, and yet it's really happening in my brain because my brain is just so fatigued with what I'm going through. And so, different kinds of indescript pain, but there's all kinds of things. I mean, the list is long of what you might feel physically that might be an indication that burnout is happening. But also there's some symptoms related to just your mental life. So one of the things we know about burnout is it decreases activity in the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that sits kind of right behind my eyebrows. And it's sort of the best developed part of our brain. It does some very, very complex things, complex planning. It helps kind of regulate our impulses and sort of balances out our emotions. There's a lot of wonderful things part of our brain does. When we're burned out, there's reduced activity there. So as a result, I may start to struggle with working memory. I mean, all of us walk down a hallway at some point and get halfway down the hallway and go, what was I doing? What was I going down this hallway for? That happens to all of us. But if it starts happening a lot, right, that can be a sign of burnout. Getting sort of more rigid about things have to be my way. Being a little bit sharp with people or sort of just withdrawing from people can be a sign of that. I think spiritually, if you look at Elijah, right, one of the things that for those of us who follow God, one of the things that's very common with burnout is feelings of shame and feelings of failure. I'm just not being the Christian that I need to be. And even kind of sometimes I think doubting our salvation. It was interesting to me that in my dad's darkest hours, he asked me, how do you know for sure that you're saved? And I thought, are you asking me because you're worried that, because he thought he was dying. I thought, are you worried you're going to die and I'm not going to be saved? So I thought maybe he was asking about my spiritual condition. But then as our conversation unfolded, I realized he was asking about his spiritual condition. And I'd never heard anybody explain the gospel as well as he had. And I thought, what is going on here? But the thing about it is there's a spiritual component. There's a spiritual component of doubt and shame and feelings of failure. Remember Elijah said, he said, I'm no better than those who came before me. And so I think those are symptoms. If you want to look at what we would consider to be the prototypical symptoms within the research, we would say there are three parts of burnout. These are Dr. Maslach's model, Dr. Christina Maslach, and she's the main burnout researcher out there. That there is emotional exhaustion, which just means I don't have anything else to give anybody anymore. I don't have any emotional energy. There's nothing in the tank. There is what she calls depersonalization, and it really is just a moving away from the person that I am. I start to withdraw from things I used to love. I withdraw from work that I used to be so engaged in. And I even start to withdraw from people that I care about, just as Elijah left his servant behind when he went into the wilderness. And then finally, there is reduced feelings of personal accomplishment, or you could just think of it as feelings of failure. I begin to view myself as a failure. And when all of those three things stack up together, I don't have anything more to give you. I'm sort of pulling away from who I am as a person, and I feel like I've failed. That is what burnout looks like. And you kind of see it because you see that person just get to the point where they're totally exhausted. They seem to be isolating. And then whenever you talk to them, you hear that very negative script of self-doubt and shame and failure. And when those things are the case, it's time to start getting some help, because what we know is that burnout left unto itself can lead to a lot of other mental health concerns burnout is distressing enough, but we don't want it to go to an even darker place.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and be right back with Dr. Jonathan Hoover talking about burnout, how to recover from it or how to avoid it altogether. The book is called Stress Fracture, Your Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're talking with Dr. Jonathan Hoover, author of the book Stress Fracture, Your Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout. And Who, Dr. Hoover, is most susceptible to being burned out? I think about the people, especially who were medical people during COVID,
Mm,
and how so many of them left the field after COVID
yes.
ended, and it was because they were just so burned out. And but we know
Mhm.
that so many, and pastors, we hear that there's a huge
Yes.
incidence of burnout with pastors. It seems like people
Mhm.
in the service field are particularly susceptible.
Dr. Maslach has always said that the people who are most likely to get burned out are people who work with people. So that's a pretty broad category. But I would like to think of it this way, right? Burnout is caused by doing too much for too long, right? It is the interaction of strain and time, and that can happen in almost any circumstance. But what I mean by the strain and time thing is, Lori, if we were to ask somebody to hold a weight and just, hold it with your arm straight out there, it wouldn't even have to be much, maybe a 5-pound weight. Hey, hold this weight. How's that feel? And they're going to say, feels like nothing. It's fine. It's fine. Right? Okay, great. And then we're to say, all right, the whole time we're doing this interview, just keep holding that weight. And then we get done with the interview and be like, hey, we'll come back in an hour. While we're gone, just keep holding that weight. What will happen is they will start to hurt. They'll start to have pain. They will start to sweat. It will start to be a whole lot for them to manage. And eventually they're just going to drop that weight because it's just too much, right? So what a lot of times people think is that people get burned out because they're going through tremendous stress. And that can be the case, but it's not just stress. It's the repetitiveness of the stress. It is that wearing down of that same stressor over and over and over and over again. And we're writing these energy checks out of our energy bank account every day to take care of this sort of recurring stress. And what happens is we're not aware of how low that balance is getting. And one day we write that check and it bounces. That's what burnout is, right? It gets to the point where we used to be able to bear up under this stress, but we can't anymore. And I think one of the challenges with that is part of the shame script of burnout. We look at what we're dealing with and we think, I ought to be able to handle this, just like we might look at a 5-pound weight and say, I ought to be able to hold that. And you can for a certain period of time. You mentioned taking care of an elderly loved one, right? You may look at one day of that and say, that's totally doable. And it probably is, but you may need help the more days it is, the more time that passes, because that stress tends to compound on itself. So I would say that anybody in a position where they're under a good bit of stress and it is repetitive, cyclical stress, I think those are the people who are really in the crosshairs of burnout. And especially in our society, here's the deal, Lori, you and I both know this. We live in a society where we're lured to believe that we are infinite because we live in a society that doesn't believe in God. And part of that luring to believe that we are infinite is we do think we can write those energy checks and they're just always going to be there. And part of our acceptance of the fact that God is God and we are not is recognizing that I do have a finite balance in that energy bank account. And that as time goes on, I really have to be careful about that repetitive stress. So that is a long answer to your very wonderful short question. I think the person that is most in the crosshairs is the person where that stress is accumulating and they may not even realize it.
And, initially we think of people when they finally burn out, they quit. That, like I said before, a lot of these people, they were nurses and doctors, they're like, I'm out. And pastors, you see this a lot too. I'm done. Marriages, people quit their job. Aside from quitting, the second thing that comes to mind is a lot of people say, hey, I need a month off to go on a Caribbean cruise or something like that. But a lot of us who are burned out can't do that. We can't stop. We can't take a vacation. We can't quit. How do we deal with burnout in practical ways?
You talk about people quitting, that breaks my heart. It really, really does, especially in the ministry, because can I tell you what I've seen happen? I've seen people in ministry that have gotten burned out and they've quit. They go to their board of elders or their board of trustees and say, I am just in terrible shape and I don't think I can be your pastor anymore. And the board of elders or board of trustees doesn't know how to take that, but okay, this person says they need to quit. They let them quit. And what happens is that pastor gets 6 weeks of rest And then they come back and they're like, I'm ready to go. Turns out I'm okay. But at that point, sort of the damage has been done. It's very difficult to sort of back up through that decision. And it's not just in ministry. That's the case in all kinds of different work. And what often happens is you have a person who regrets the decision to leave once they realize that they can recover. I always tend to encourage people, when you're going through a season of burnout, be very cautious about making life-altering decisions like leaving a job or doing something huge, because you're not really, your full faculties aren't there. So it's maybe not the best time to make a huge decision. I hope that in my book, what we did was give a whole lot of different things a person can do rather than quit. Talking about strategic rest, talking about how to relook at your list of tasks and think about what can be altered, what can be delegated, what may be, we call this reducing the unnecessary and refining the clumsy, because there are certain things that may be unnecessary that we can get rid of. And then there are things that we can't get rid of, but maybe we're doing it in a clumsy way and we can refine how we do it. We talk in the book about taking breaks, really, really important, even micro breaks. We talk about relaxation techniques. There are a lot of things that a person can do even when they are burned out. I mean, at this point, we're not even talking about burnout prevention. In the throes of burnout, there are a lot of things you can do besides walk away. And it does sadden me to see people walk away because they have such potential. Usually if a person was stressed enough to get burned out, they usually had a lot of potential. And that potential doesn't go away just because you're burned out. It will come back, just as God told Elijah to get back on the job. Right? I think there's the potential to go back and be just as successful as you were before, just with a different way of approaching your stress.
All right, we're going to take another break and be right back with Dr. Jonathan Hoover. The book is called Stress Fracture, Your Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're talking about how to beat burnout, how to recover from it or avoid it altogether. My guest is Dr. Jonathan Hoover, author of Stress Fracture, Your Ultimate Guide to Beating Burnout. So before the break, you discussed briefly about some ways to recover from burnout. Can you elaborate more on this? This is the meat of the book, and we need some practical tips.
Just think of it like you would if you were at a gym and you're lifting weight and you hurt yourself. Okay, there's 3 options that you can do. One is you can decide to lift less weight, right? That's usually the hardest sell for me, is to convince leaders who are burned out that they should lift less weight, like you need to do less. The second one is to lift it in a different way. So maybe maybe at the gym, I'm lifting something from an odd angle and I strain myself. Maybe if I change the way that I do this, then it'll be easier. And a lot of times at work or at home or wherever I'm getting under all this stress, maybe just making a few tweaks could help. The third thing is I can make some healthy decisions outside the gym that would make me be more likely to do well inside the gym. So instead of eating a dozen donuts and drinking a bunch of soda before going to the gym, maybe I would be a little bit more intentional about that. So I would say one of the first things that I do with people that are going through burnout is try to find out, is there anything that we can reduce? That's low-hanging fruit. Is there anything that we can take that is de-stressing you, right? So not good stress. If there's something you enjoy doing, I don't want to take that off your list, but is there something that's distressing that somehow we just really could jettison? It could get delegated or it could get reduced. If that's possible, wonderful. Secondly, if it's something we can't get rid of, then we want to evaluate, is there a better way to do this? Maybe if it's at work, is there a better software to do this? Is there a better routine to do this? Can we do it in a way that causes you less stress? And then the third thing is just making healthy choices. And I'm sort of underplaying the idea of making healthy choices, which is a key part of the book, right? That I need to be taking care of myself physically. I need to be taking care of myself emotionally. All of this sort of foundation of my health, I can ignore because I'm so stressed. Well, I don't have time to take care of myself because I'm so stressed. Actually, when I'm stressed is when I have to take the best care of myself, my best diet, my best exercise regimen, getting the best amount of sleep. So right off the bat, the first things that I would do is I would get rid of what I can. I would do what I can't get rid of better. And then I would try to find a way to be healthier. And those are all things that we explore in depth in the book.
But it's funny because when you are stressed, when you are burned out, that's when you reach for the junk food. That's when you reach for the alcohol. Yes. That's when you're constantly scrolling. I mean, all these bad habits that make it worse is what we do when we're stressed out. And you're saying we should do the opposite.
It's those times where you have to be strategic about self-care. But don't want to be a hypocrite here. In the middle of writing this book, I was under a book deadline, and I was not taking good care of myself physically. And I had a men's group at the church who wanted me to come work out with them. And I told them that I couldn't because I was so busy. And I felt like such a hypocrite that day because I'm writing this section on taking physical care of yourself. And I'm saying that it's so important when you're stressed to take care of yourself. And I'm doing the opposite. It's hard. It's hard to take care of yourself when you're stressed, but it's absolutely 100% the right thing to do. And it helps get you out of that hole because God created us to handle stress, but God also didn't create us not to take care of ourselves. So we have to take care of ourselves physically, emotionally, and spiritually for sure. There are some other things I talk about in the book, but those are really key. And in doing that, we really put ourselves in a better position to fight the battle with stress.
All right, we're going to take one final break and be right back with Dr. Jonathan Hoover. The book is called Stress Fracture. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're talking with Dr. Jonathan Hoover, author of the book Stress Fracture, about burnout. And you did mention briefly there are biblical examples of this, right?
Yes, Elijah, Martha. I mean, the examples are, they start to leap from the pages once you kind of know what you're looking for. And it's great to know that it's not a new problem. And it's also great to know that God gives us guidance on what to do about it.
And it is so common these days, isn't it? Isn't it estimated about 1 in 4 people are dealing with burnout?
In some occupations, it's as high as 40%. So I think the number that you're stating is very good, but also conservative. Depending on how hard the occupation is, it can be as high as almost 1 in 2. So it's something that is really, really hurting us in the workplace today, and something we've got to get a grip on for sure.
And I'm so glad that you wrote this book and that we're talking about it, because people can have these feelings and not really know what they are. I think maybe they're depression, maybe I'm just tired, maybe I need something, a new job, a new spouse, a new religion, whatever. But really, it's just burnout. Where can folks find out more about this book? Where can they get the book and also find out more about you, Dr. Hoover?
Oh, so kind of you to ask. Well, you can read the whole first chapter of the book if you want. If you go to stressfracturebook.com, and it's available wherever books are sold, on all the normal places. And then if you'd like to know a little bit about the ministry that I serve, you can go to newspring.org. It's a church in Wichita, Kansas that I serve. And then, of course, you can connect with me through Regent University. I know that you would expect me to say this, but it is the greatest Christian university in our country, and I love being at Regent. You can connect with me through any of those ways.
All right. Well, thank you once again for being on the program and for your outstanding work. I agree with you about Regent. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.
And thanks to you viewers for tuning into this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next week.